welcome to the debate. So I want you to imagine you're watching a manufacturing assembly line. The conveyor belt has been dialed up to, its absolute maximum speed. The workers are scrambling, their hands are just moving in a blur, and inevitably a fragile component falls to the floor and shatters.
Right, and the immediate reflexive instinct of anyone watching is to look at the worker who dropped it and ask, well, why weren't you paying closer attention?
Exactly. It's localized blame for what is actually a structural failure. Because the more interesting question, the more necessary question really, is who set the speed of the belt in the first place.
Oh, that's a great analogy.
Right? So today, we are pulling from a fascinating mix of organizational behavior studies, HR strategy, and hard legal precedents to examine a really profound tension in modern work. We are asking, does a heavy workload and a misaligned organizational reward structure excuse managers from failing to practice fairness? Or is workplace fairness an individualized leadership duty that, simply cannot be bypassed, regardless of what the system demands?
It is a phenomenal topic because the lines of accountability are so often blurred here. I take the position that while systemic pressures obviously exist, individual managers cannot be excused by their workloads. True fairness requires localized situational awareness, empathy, and the explicit rejection of blanket sameness policies. These are foundational leadership traits. They're not secondary tasks that you can just discard because your calendar gets full.
And I take the contrasting position. I argue that systemic pressures, specifically, heavy workloads and organizational reward structures that prioritize technical output above all else, those are the primary drivers of workplace unfairness. When a manager fails to act fairly, it is largely because the organizational architecture has structurally forced them to neglect fairness.
Okay, forced is a very strong word.
I use it intentionally, and I base it on the mechanics of how organizations actually operate. Let's look at the research from the Academy of Management Journal by Elliot Scherf, Vijaya Venkataramani, and Ravi Gajendran. Their work fundamentally shifts how we need to view fairness. They establish that fairness is not just an abstract personality trait or like a generalized aura of being a good person. Fairness is composed of concrete, resource-intensive actions that they call justice tasks.
Which would include things like taking the time to explain the rationale behind a difficult decision, right? Or actively soliciting input from the team before changing a protocol.
Right, exactly. Making decision-making transparent, acknowledging unseen contributions, these are tangible tasks. And they take significant time. The reality is that organizations routinely create what these researchers identify as a high workload, low justice rewards environment. The company explicitly and implicitly rewards a manager for hitting quotas, shipping products, or closing deals. They do not reward these justice tasks. So when a manager is overburdened, their brain enters a mild threat state. They prioritize the tasks that ensure their survival in the company.
That is a compelling argument, but have you considered the fundamental conceptual flaw in treating fairness as a discrete task to begin with?
What do you mean?
Well, drawing on insights from HR Path and the People Alliance, I argue that fairness cannot be relegated to an item on a to-do list. Fairness is not a separate task you get to when the real work is done. It is the manner in which all technical tasks are executed.
But if the manner of execution inherently requires more time the manager physically doesn't have, how is that not a structural deficit?
Because failing at fairness is almost always a failure of perception and judgment, not a lack of time. Let me give you an example. Managers frequently fail at fairness when they mistakenly assume that, treating everyone the exact same way equals fairness.
The old sameness trap.
Exactly. True fairness is equity. It is recognizing difference. It's making a reasonable adjustment for an employee managing a disability or someone returning from a bereavement. Understanding those nuances requires situational awareness. That responsibility lies entirely in the manager's judgment. I'll say it. If you are too busy to be fair, you are too busy to lead.
Okay, wait, I want to pause here because I think our listeners who are middle managers are probably screaming at their steering wheels right now.
Oh, I'm sure they are.
You are essentially asking them to be workplace therapists and perfectly attuned observers of human behavior when they barely have time to eat lunch. Let's look at the mechanism of what actually happens to human capacity under pressure. The Academy of Management Journal study wasn't just a survey. It was a rigorous 3-part investigation into this exact phenomenon.
I'm familiar with the methodology, but walk us through why you think it absolves the individual.
First, they looked at U.S. managers who tracked their daily workloads against their engagement in justice behaviors. On heavy workload days, justice behaviors plummeted.
Naturally. But self-reporting is always tricky, you know? Managers might just be making excuses for their bad days.
Which is exactly why the researchers didn't stop there. They did a second study with manager-employee groups in India, where the employees rated the manager's fairness. The exact same pattern emerged. But the third part of the study is the clincher, because it isolates the variable of the organizational reward structure.
Right, the simulation.
Placing individuals in a hypothetical company. Some had high workloads, some low, but crucially, some were in a low justice rewards organization, while others were in a balanced rewards organization.
Where the balanced organization actually incentivized those justice behaviors.
Yes, and the high workload group in the low rewards company neglected fairness to focus on technical tasks, predictably. But in the organizations that rewarded justice tasks, the workload effect was far less severe. The managers actually found ways to complete both. So I see why you think that individual judgment is the key, but let me give you a different perspective. Asking managers to perform unrewarded justice tasks in a high-pressure environment is exactly like asking employees to perform unpaid overtime. Out of the goodness of their hearts, some might do it for a while, but eventually human limits are reached and the system breaks. You cannot rely on individual heroism to fix a structural deficit.
Okay, I understand the mechanism the researchers are identifying, I really do, but I fundamentally attack the framework they are using to define the manager's role in that high-pressure environment. Let's look at how this pursuit of efficiency under pressure actually manifests in the real world. According to the People Alliance research, one of the primary signs of workplace inequities is uneven workload distribution. When a manager is under immense pressure and the conveyor belt is speeding up, what do?
They lean on their best people. They give the most critical, demanding tasks to the high performers they trust to deliver quickly, which, by the way, is a rational survival mechanism.
Rational for the manager's short-term technical output, perhaps, but it is disastrous for fairness. It actively creates an incredibly inequitable environment. The high performers are driven straight into burnout, while other employees are underutilized, overlooked, and actively denied growth opportunities. The manager's pursuit of systemic efficiency directly authors localized inequality.
That's a fair point, but
You say the system is forcing their hand, but it is the manager's specific, localized judgment call to overburden one employee and ignore another. They aren't passive victims of a fast conveyor belt, they're the ones aggressively pulling the levers.
But that judgment call isn't happening in a vacuum. It is a product of cognitive tunneling.
Explain what you mean by that in this context.
When a manager's workload spikes, they experience a massive increase in cognitive load. Their peripheral vision narrows to only the tasks that ensure their professional survival, the technical metrics. The brain relies on heuristics, which are basically cheap computational shortcuts because it is out of processing power.
Right.
Bias is a heuristic. When you have an hour to assign a critical project, you don't evaluate everyone's growth potential equally. You rely on proximity bias, who is nearest to you, or affinity bias, who reminds you of yourself or who has historically made you look good. The structural pressure directly generates the reliance on that bias.
That is a fascinating explanation of the how, but it does not excuse the what. Managing your own psychological biases and heuristics is an internal cognitive requirement of being a leader. It is not an extra justice task that requires 3 more hours in the day. It is the job, which brings us to the clues that leaders miss when they are supposedly too busy.
You're referring to the behavioral indicators of unfairness.
Exactly.
Employees very rarely walk into an office sit-down and explicitly declare, I am being treated unfairly by the organizational structure. The clues are almost entirely behavioral. We are looking at rising absenteeism. We are looking at a sudden fading of enthusiasm. We are looking at silent employees who stop contributing in meetings, or just a quiet, steady dip in productivity. A manager who claims to be too busy is often just a manager who is failing to pay attention to the psychological landscape of their own team. They use consistency as a shield.
How do you mean, a shield?
They think, well, I enforce the rules exactly the same way for everyone, so I am immune to claims of favoritism or unfairness. They hide behind sameness because sameness is fast.
And I have to push back heavily on the practical reality of what you're asking these managers to do. If an organization's structure deprives the manager of the time required to hold skip-level meetings, to deploy confidential pulse surveys, or to have open exploratory conversations beyond a rigid annual review, how can we possibly expect them to notice a quiet employee's fading enthusiasm?
But
You are demanding localized empathy, but empathy requires the oxygen of time. It requires margin. If the organization has suffocated the manager's schedule, missing those subtle behavioral clues is an inevitable, mechanical outcome, not a lack of care.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. Empathy does not require an hour-long scheduled meeting on a calendar. It requires a fundamental shift in perspective during the interactions you are already having. Let's look at the insights from HR Path regarding the Equality Act 2010. Employers have a legal duty to make reasonable adjustments. Fairness requires flexibility, not uniformity. When a manager uses the metric, am I treating everyone exactly the same, they are actually creating unfairness.
Because people are starting from different baselines.
Precisely. Every employee brings different experiences, needs, and circumstances. Consider an employee who processes information differently due to a neurodivergent condition, or someone who is returning to work after a severe personal hardship. The manager doesn't need a corporate pulse survey to handle this correctly. In fact, there are 5 very specific questions managers can and should ask themselves in real time, regardless of their workload.
Okay, what are they?
First, am I giving each person what they reasonably need to do their job well? Second, who am I defaulting to when I'm stressed?
Checking that proximity bias?
Exactly. Third, have I actually explained the why behind this difficult decision, or did I just issue an edict? Fourth, am I mistaking equal treatment for equitable treatment? And fifth, is my team's silence right now a sign of agreement or a sign of burnout?
Okay, those are powerful questions.
Right. Asking those doesn't take extra hours. It takes a different mindset.
I completely appreciate the distinction between equality, which is sameness, and equity, which is giving people what they need. But even identifying what an individual reasonably needs requires a diagnostic process. It requires a conversation. More importantly, it requires the structural authority to grant that flexibility. If upper management rigidly monitors metrics and penalizes the frontline manager for any deviation in process, that manager is paralyzed. If they grant flexibility to one employee, the system flags it as an inefficiency.
But the legal framework of reasonable adjustments dictates that flexibility is required by law. Refusing to make adjustments because a manager is worried about systemic inefficiency or because it wouldn't look fair to the others is a massive misconception. It exposes the company to immense legal risk. The consistency should be in the manager's decision-making framework, not in producing identical outcomes for every human being.
Well, if we are going to look at how companies protect themselves legally, that thread actually reinforces my argument that the system is the ultimate problem. Let's consider the insights from Michelle J. Douglas, an employment litigator with decades of experience dealing with workplace disputes. She points out a devastating reality about internal HR departments.
The conflict of interest.
Exactly. Under legal precedents like Farragher versus City of Boca Raton, employees are generally required to utilize internal complaint mechanisms, like going to HR, before they can file a lawsuit. The system is entirely designed to handle disputes internally, but Douglas highlights that HR departments are structurally ineffective because of an inherent, unavoidable conflict of interest. Their economic livelihood is tied to the employer.
They are paid by the company to protect the company.
Right. Their mandate is risk mitigation for the corporate entity, If a high-producing manager is accused of unfairness, HR's underlying structural incentive is to protect the revenue stream, which is the manager, not the rank-and-file employee. Furthermore, HR professionals develop regular communications and friendships with supervisors. They are part of the same management class. If the designated safety net is structurally biased by its very economic design, how can we place the burden of fairness on the frontline manager? They are existing within a corporate structure that is inherently biased towards self-preservation. When the system itself is structurally incapable of unbiased dispute resolution, blaming the individual manager for failing to be fair is missing the forest for the trees.
See, I look at that exact same reality, the deeply flawed nature of internal HR, and I draw the complete opposite conclusion.
Wait, how so?
The fact that HR has an inherent conflict of interest is precisely why managerial accountability is the whole ballgame. Because the systemic safety net is compromised, the frontline manager's localized empathy, integrity, and situational awareness are the only true defense an employee has.
But that is an immense burden to place on middle management. You're acknowledging the system is rigged, and your solution is to ask the manager to just be better than the system?
It is the burden of leadership. When an employee finally works up the courage to come forward and express a concern about inequity, HR might approach it from a risk mitigation standpoint, but the manager has the power to listen without defensiveness. The manager has the power to acknowledge the employee's experience, make the localized adjustment, and communicate the outcome transparently. If we accept your premise that the system is fundamentally flawed and biased, then we cannot rely on the system to fix fairness. We must rely on the individual leader choosing to act with integrity despite the system.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because it essentially absolves the architects of the system from fixing the architecture. If we just tell managers, hey, the system is broken, HR is conflicted, you have no time, so you need to be a hero, we guarantee that fairness will only exist in isolated pockets where exceptional individuals happen to work. That is not a sustainable model for a healthy organization.
So what is the sustainable model from a structural perspective?
To achieve widespread reliable equity, we must change the architecture. Upper-level management must fundamentally adjust job descriptions. They have to explicitly reward the justice tasks we talked about earlier. If fairness is important, it must be measured, and it must dictate bonuses and promotions just as much as technical output. If a manager takes 2 hours to properly mediate a dispute and accommodate an employee's return from leave, that should be celebrated as a key performance indicator, not punished as a drop in weekly productivity. Furthermore, to address the HR bias Douglas points out, companies must utilize unbiased third-party investigators, neutral professionals whose compensation is not tied to the outcome of the investigation. We fix fairness by fixing the structure.
And I argue that relying on sweeping structural overhauls is a convenient way to avoid the hard, daily work of leadership. Yes, upper management should align rewards. I don't disagree with that at all. Yes, third-party investigators are a brilliant solution for formal complaints, but structural overhauls take years. In the day-to-day reality of the workplace, lower-level managers must be deliberate with their time and their attention right now. They cannot leave justice to chance or say, well, I'll be fair when the CEO finally updates my KPI dashboard.
But they are humans operating under cognitive load.
They are leaders. Fairness is not an initiative rolled out by corporate, it is a fundamental standard of conduct. They must consciously manage their own biases, distribute workloads equitably, even when it's tempting to just dump it all on the top performer, and tailor their support. In fact, if the structure is broken, employees also have to navigate this with their leaders directly before going to a compromised HR department.
Oh, interesting. How do you mean?
There are 5 key questions employees can ask to get clear with their leaders and establish boundaries. First, what metrics are actually driving my performance review right now? Second, how can we balance this new request with my current workload?
Asking for structural prioritization.
Exactly. Third, can we clarify the why behind this recent project assignment? Fourth, what does success look like for me in this specific context? And fifth, how do we handle situations where I need an adjustment to do my best work? Those questions force the manager to pause and engage in justice tasks, regardless of the overarching system.
That's a highly proactive approach for the employee, which I like. As we look to synthesize these perspectives, we find ourselves grappling with a deeply complex reality. On my side, I maintain that human behavior is largely a product of its environment. Fairness will only be sustainably achieved when organizational reward structures explicitly incentivize it, and when workloads are actively managed to allow for the time it requires. The cognitive tunneling caused by extreme workloads makes bias inevitable. We simply cannot demand behaviors that our systems actively punish.
Right. And my summary is that fairness is a foundational leadership mindset. It is the practice of equity and situational awareness. It is how you distribute the work, how you recognize difference, and how you manage your own cognitive shortcuts. It is not a technical output that can be excused by busy schedule or a lack of systemic rewards. If you strip away the system, the leader's localized judgment is the only thing that actually touches the employee's daily experience.
Yet despite our differing angles on where the ultimate responsibility lies, we entirely converge on the gravity of the issue. The stakes are immense here. As we saw from the data, the EEOC received over 88,000 charges of workplace discrimination in 2024 alone. This is not a theoretical debate about office politeness.
No, it absolutely isn't. The consequences of ignoring unfairness are devastating. It's not just the legal risk, which is substantial as we've discussed. It is the quiet, systemic erosion of trust. It leads to severe disengagement, high turnover, and the loss of phenomenal talent who simply refuse to operate in an environment where their dignity is treated as an afterthought or just a secondary task.
Navigating the systemic pressures of corporate metrics while honoring the deeply human need for individualized equity is perhaps the defining challenge of modern work. The source materials we've drawn from today, from the Academy of Management Journal to the legal frameworks of dispute resolution, offer even deeper explorations into how organizations can rethink their architecture and their expectations. I really encourage everyone to examine them.
The tension between the demands of the system and the integrity of the individual will always exist. The real question is how we choose to navigate it when the pressure is on.
Exactly. If the conveyor belt of our daily work is moving too fast, perhaps it is time we stop merely blaming the hands that drop the product and start examining the machinery itself. Or perhaps true leadership is having the courage to reach out and pull the emergency stop, regardless of what the factory manager says. We leave it to you to evaluate your own workplaces and decide where the ultimate responsibility for fairness truly lies. Thank you for joining us.